Hey everyone, welcome back to Grief Uncensored.
I'm Yako.
And I'm Julia. We believe that your grief is yours and no one can tell you what to do with it. But we're glad you're here and we're glad that you found us. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, where we do a Feature Your Loved One series and have a great little community over there at Grief Uncensored Podcast.
Yes, and be sure to follow us on Facebook or like our Facebook page rather to show some support there. We also have a Facebook group for other grieving young adults just like us. You can go share your experience and meet a bunch of people who know and have had similar experiences to you. We also have a TikTok where we make unhinged TikToks. Go follow us on there. And we recently started a Twitter, so just all these social platforms for you to support us on. Finally, we have a YouTube video version of our podcast that we release every week. If you are more of a visual person and want to see us do our thing, you can go on YouTube to find the video there. And the link to everything we just mentioned is all in our Instagram bio.
So, how are you doing this week, Yako?
I'm doing okay. Mentally, I feel like I'm kind of in like a numbing it out mood or not numbing it out, but kind of like in a mood where I'm like staying busy to not really think about anything.
Interesting.
But I'm kind of aware of that. I'm doing that and I'm trying to be more mindful about spreading out my awareness, I guess, throughout the day. So it's not just like one moment of stillness that overwhelms me with all my thoughts all at once, which tends to happen,
Yeah.
And we talk about that in our Waves of Grief episode.
Yeah, 100%.
But yeah, I've kind of fallen into the routine of like just constantly trying to do something, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I am being extremely productive, but at the same time, I find that that gives you less time to really sit with your feelings and thoughts.
I mean, it's hard to find that balance. Like, what even is the balance? Is there even a balance of like being in your present life and like you said, being productive, but then you feel like if you're being too productive, you're ignoring your grief, and then you're like, I'm bottling this up, but I'm aware I'm bottling it up, but I also am doing my thing. So it's like very complicated.
Yeah, that reminds me of this Instagram post we made a while ago. It was like a journal entry I wrote, and it was pretty much just kind of along the lines of when I start to feel okay, I start to overthink and wonder why I'm doing okay. Is it because I'm ignoring the things that hurt me and pain me? Like, it's like this duality of like, am I doing okay because I'm actually doing okay?
Yeah.
Is it because I'm ignoring what's not okay?
Yeah, you're questioning the reality of your feelings. Like, you're feeling this emotion right now, but then you're like, but am I really? Really interesting.
Yeah, how are you though?
I mean, I relate to what you're saying. Like, I think lately I have been getting more settled into my life in the new city that I moved to, and, just kind of figuring out my life and what I'm going to do with it. And I think as a 23-year-old, that's very normal to be, doing that at this age. But I feel like I'm always thinking about how I had to deal with like setbacks, which grief was my setback, obviously. And I think it still like heavily affects how I move through the day. And like I find myself wanting to be able to overcome it just so I can like figure out my life and not feel like I'm falling behind my peers and stuff.
Right.
But overall, like I think I've been doing a good job at that. Like, trying to at least stay positive and like give myself some grace that I don't have to like compare myself to other people and stuff. It's easier said than done, but like I think overall I know that I'm doing the best I can. And even though maybe other people don't see that or see me as like being successful, but in my own opinion, like I think that I'm doing a great job.
And that's all that matters.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I don't feel that way. I feel like I'm really down on myself and hard on myself a lot of times. But like, I think overall, I'm able to say that I know what the fuck I've been through and I know where the fuck I am now. And
Exactly.
like nobody's gonna fucking tell me that I'm not doing well, you
Yeah, no
know?
one can take that away from you, exactly like our intro says. And like, it's your experience, and we know how grief is so isolating and no one can really understand all of that. Well, no one can also really understand what the fuck you went through, it's hard to explain,
Exactly.
but
Exactly.
oh,
But I mean, I still deal with a lot of the grief waves, like you said, and it sometimes feels really fucking heavy,
yeah.
like it really does. And I think the last couple days have been more of, the incoming waves coming for me.
Hmm.
And like last night, I was just like looking at TikTok, but something on TikTok set me off, and it wasn't even anything like grief related. I think it was just like maybe, oh my God, you know what it was? It was a mom packing their lunch for their kids.
Oh,
The way that shit sent me the fuck off.
yeah.
And I was just crying and crying because I was just like really feeling guilty for the times I like threw my lunch away or like complained about my lunch
Oh
that my
my God,
mom
I
would make
completely
me,
relate. Yeah.
or like I sometimes wouldn't eat it, and I don't know, like just like all these small things that
Yep.
it plays into like the whole guilt thing, but also like I
Mm,
do feel sad, and especially yesterday with the wave coming in, I felt really guilty for not like telling her I loved her more and like really making her feel like, she was an amazing mom. And like, I don't know, that's just how I was feeling. I was just really remembering all the times where I could have spent more time with her or I could have been more present, and like it just sends me spiraling because I regret not being more appreciative and present in the moment. I didn't realize that she would ever not be here anytime soon.
right.
And even when she would come visit in San Diego, I would love her there and like I would want to spend every minute with her, of course. Like I never mistreated that, but I also didn't cherish it enough.
Hmm.
But anyway, yeah, the mental health thing has definitely been a little hard lately. But again, it always comes in waves. Like a couple days I'll be good. The next couple days I'm like, okay, I can really feel that like grief and depression coming in.
Yeah.
But that's a good segue into what we're actually talking about today, which is World Mental Health Day is on October 10th, according to the World Health Organization. And this week is Mental Health Awareness Week nationally. October 3rd to the 7th, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So this week, we're just going to be outlining some of the mental health issues and disorders, whatever you want to call them, and kind of putting them through the lens of grief and how we've kind of dealt with certain depression and anxiety disorders before and after our grief and how that's changed. But first, we can talk a little bit about overall, I mean, like COVID, for instance, how much that changed everyone's mental health.
Yeah. According to the World Health Organization, before the pandemic in 2019, it was like an estimated 1 in 8 people globally who were living with mental disorder or mental illness. And now it's 1 in 5.
Mm-hmm.
And for people under the age of 17, it's 1 in 6. So, of those people, less than half, 46.2% of US adults with mental illness have received treatment in 2020. And overall, the COVID pandemic has created a global crisis for mental health, fueling short and long term stresses. Of course, our whole living environment has changed so much, and there's so many more things to worry and stress about.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, of course, but the result of that is that it put a rise in both anxiety and depressive disorders at more than 25% during the first year of the pandemic. The prolonged period of isolation, the
Mm-hmm.
fear of like just stepping outside in contact with other people, like all of that. At the same time, though, because of COVID, there was a shortage in workers. It was inaccessible. You couldn't go anywhere. Because of that, mental health services have been severely disrupted, and the treatment gap for mental health conditions has widened. which is so bad because it was already pretty inaccessible and unaffordable for so many people.
Mhm. Like everything just got worse, you know?
Exactly.
And then like once we all kind of came out of the COVID bubble finally after like 2 years, we were like, okay, looking around, like
Yeah.
everything's fine, you know, trying like, I don't know, I feel like we were excited to finally go back in the world that we kind of stopped talking about the effects that the pandemic actually had on us.
Yeah, like we're kind of just moving on from the traumatic couple years we literally had, like
Hmm.
the life altering. And I find that even for myself is that I'm like way more of an introverted person. I like to be a little bit more at home than I used to before. And you
Me
know,
too.
I'm not as socially out there.
Yeah, me too. Which honestly, sometimes I feel sad about because
Yeah.
I used to be very like outgoing and just want to like get out, but now I feel more comfortable at home,
Hmm.
which is like good in some
Maybe that
ways,
also
but
comes with like getting older too,
yeah,
because
for sure.
yeah,
Definitely.
even though
Because when the pandemic hit, we were only like literally sophomores.
I turned 21 in the pandemic, so
Yeah, like we're pandemic graduates through and through, you know?
yeah, pandy
We only got
grads.
like 2 years of
Yeah.
but yeah, we were in like the deep college experience and then we kind of just got shoved out of that and now we're here and it's like fucking weird. And
Yeah.
like we're kind of trying to find our footing, you know?
Right. And like we've talked about in other episodes too, the pandemic, of course, had a huge impact on mental illness, but it also had an enormous effect on the grief community too, because the anticipatory grief was much worse because there was nothing you could do. There was no meeting up with the person that you were having this
Yeah.
anticipatory
I
grief
mean, it
of.
had a really big impact on the grief
Yeah,
community.
people
Or,
weren't able to properly have any closure because, you know, funeral services were held on Zoom, or, you know, you had to do a drive-by funeral
Mhm.
service where you like pull up in your car. Certain things like that, you weren't able to gather. And so that had a huge impact on the grief community, especially those who were affected by COVID and lost
Mhm.
loved ones to COVID. And that's a huge thing too, is that there were so many COVID deaths, and that's a huge number of people who are grieving
Mhm.
because of this
Mhm.
illness
Yeah.
pandemic.
COVID added so many millions and millions of people to the grief club. And also, not to mention, like during COVID, you couldn't even go visit your dying loved one in the
Yeah.
hospital per COVID regulations. So it just added so much trauma to an already fucked up situation, you know? It just rearranges everything.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of realizing while I'm sitting here right now, like,
Hmm.
it's 2022, right?
Yeah.
Like, no, has it been like a year already where we're out in the normal, quote unquote, normal? Because I feel like it's been a while, but I still feel like affected by it.
Yeah, it has been a while, but it also has affected our like perception of time in a way, because we were living in a like Truman Show, like where every day is the same for so long. I don't know. It's like it is really affecting my perception of time
Yeah.
because I'm like, that was 3 fucking years ago, or you know, something like that. I'm just like, I
Mhm.
can't even, yeah, but I think it has been over a year of like kind of back to normal because
That's so crazy.
uh,
Yeah, because it's gonna be 2023 soon. So
oh my
I think
gosh.
like I don't know. It's just right now I'm finding myself feeling kind of like bad or guilty, like feeling like I'm stuck in that. And like I don't sit every single day thinking about how COVID ruined my life, but while I'm sitting here thinking about it right now, like I am thinking about it as if it was so close. Like if we like just got out of it, you know, I still feel like
Yeah,
we
me
just got
too.
out of it. I still feel like we're just now finding our footing. Like I don't know, some people maybe have a different experience, but at least for me, like I feel like still it's just been so close. Like
Yeah,
not a lot of
I
time has
agree.
passed since all that trauma. And maybe it's because that during that time is like when I was being traumatized, like when I, you know, went through the hardest time in my life. So like of course it doesn't seem far away, you know?
Right. I agree with that feeling for sure.
But yeah, I mean, as far as resources, I know that they can be like very limited.
Mhm.
And me and Yako have talked about in the past, like when we were able to be a part of grief clubs and trying therapy, different therapists and stuff. We always advocate for speaking up for yourself and telling people about your mental health battles, about your grief, or about any type of depression or anxiety or other mental illnesses that you may be battling. Or even if you don't want to put a label on it and you're just going through a rough time, I think talking about it to anyone, even if it's like just yourself, being super honest with yourself. I know people who like just do voice memos on their phone and just talk, and just like rant and like get out their true feelings, or journal, or more conventionally, like, going to see a therapist and, kind of confiding in someone else. I think all those things can be really helpful. Not only getting it off your chest, which is what everybody says, but I also think like once you start opening that blood door, like it just comes out. Like, when you just start talking and then it just starts rolling out and rolling out. Like
Yep.
sometimes I will come on the podcast to record and I'll start talking about my experience, and then I will say things and be putting puzzle pieces together in my head that I had never even thought of before,
True.
until that exact moment of me literally spitting it out and like literally brain like webs coming together to
Yeah.
form realizations about like my experience and my grief.
Exactly.
And like it's just crazy. So normalize asking for help, telling people, speaking up, like that's really what I want Mental Health Awareness Month, week, whatever day to be about. And just normalize not having every day be a great day. Like, it's okay to be like, no, I'm not going to come out. I'm not going to see anyone. I'm not going to force myself to do anything. Like,
Yep.
I'm just going to sit with myself in these feelings today. You don't have to push them down or ignore them or even show any type of hatred towards them at all, or like unwanting towards like the feelings and emotions that you're thinking about. Like really normalize sitting with them and acknowledging them and like knowing, key moment, knowing that it's going to pass, like
Yes.
it's not going to pass and then never come back again, waves. But just being able to acknowledge and be like, okay, I'll try again tomorrow, or I'm going to take a nap and I'll try again in
In an
a
hour.
couple hours or whatever it
Yeah.
is. But like overall, I think mental awareness, like when people create all these like infographics and stuff, it can become really like,
Like commercialized almost.
yes, it can become very commercialized and very just like fake in a way, and like
Yeah.
very,
Well, I find that with the whole trend in mental health awareness in general. I mean, of course, it's much more on like the days, like the mental health awareness days and stuff.
exactly.
But it's also just like all the time. I feel like people are always making infographics, and like infographics are great because they're some very resourceful and teach you a
Mm-hmm.
lot when they're made right. But also to another degree, like people talking about it very lightheartedly sometimes, and especially
Mm-hmm.
on like TikTok and sometimes on Twitter and Instagram, it's almost like, I don't want to even say this because it's like almost made like a joke, but like it's not really a joke because for us an example, like when we're like Dead Parent Club, like it's like
Mm-hmm.
kind of a joke, but it's also like we earn the right to make that joke by having been through that traumatic experience. So I don't want to take that away from people who are making a joke out of something that they've experienced, but at the same time the consequences of that are, and I guess this is something we have to acknowledge as well, is that the severity being taken out of these things
Mm-hmm.
also has an effect on how people perceive it and how much it impacts that person or that community.
No, that's really true, honestly. And right now, when you said that, I'm thinking about how a lot of people, okay, I'm thinking of it as like a circular kind of graph, right? You start with the feeling. Let's say you are having suicidal thoughts, and
Mm-hmm.
then you kind of are battling that and you use dark humor, right? And then you start making jokes about it. And that's when we kind of be like, oh, I see like the TikToks and the memes about like, this is my 13th reason, all that kind of stuff, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it, again, like you said, you earn the right to joke about it because you actually deal with that kind of stuff. But then the joke kind of gets a little bit too far to where like people who didn't earn the right start saying it,
Yeah,
and then
because it
it's just
gets
like people being like, oh, KMS, I'm gonna kill myself for every single thing, like even if it's like something really small and it's like meant to be a
yeah.
joke. And then it's like that's when it starts to cross the line and like get a little bit distasteful.
Yeah. That is the thing I wanted to talk about though, is like the trend of mental health awareness is on the rise, but I think that we still have a long way to go. Like I still think we have a lot to learn and we have
Right.
just more to do and more to advocate for in terms of everybody getting the resources
Exactly.
and like, I don't know,
No, I see, and that's exactly the point actually I was making is that all these things like they get sensationalized, they get like passed through social media, and then they get passed through dark humor and jokes, and then like people, just society as a whole kind of takes it. And I think I'm definitely avoiding any type of like social media that tries to sensationalize it instead of actually talking about the real shit. And I
right.
think obviously the real shit is just normalizing showing your true emotions,
Hmm.
and you don't have to be ashamed of any of that, and like being actually open and accepting and kind to other people. Like it's
Yeah.
so as simple as that. And I think sometimes mental health awareness, like they get caught up in the damn infographics and the damn stupid, like not helpful things,
Yeah,
And
of course. And I think that, like I said before, there is a difference between like a really helpful infographic and something that's kind of more just
and then everyone just like posting like a heart like on the day and then never talking about it ever again.
exactly. But yeah, let's talk a little bit more about our experience with mental health and mental illness. Yeah.
I think that before I began my grief journey 2 years ago, I did battle to a certain level of depression and anxiety. Um, and I did go see a therapist for a little while, but I ended up just kind of stopping and figuring it out on my own, which obviously did not work because like I just think that again it was like normalized to go get therapy. It's like everyone's like, oh my god, therapy, normalized therapy, but like going to therapy was still like weird, and this was before the pandemic and all this stuff, right? But I think I was like on the rise, and I was like kind of coming out of it, learning how to set my boundaries, what makes me happy, protecting my peace, whatever, all this shit, right? And then my mom died, right? At the like worst time. Never a good time, but for me, it was truly the absolute worst time because I felt like I was coming out of my shell and I was graduating and I was like about to be the person stepping into the person who I wanted to become and all this shit. No, it like pulled the rug out from under me. And needless to say, brought my depression and anxiety to a whole nother level, to new levels I couldn't even fathom before.
Right.
And, after being in that for the last 2 years, I know that I'm not alone and that I've really found a place within those feelings, through this podcast and through just like relating to other people who I know have literally felt the exact same things or really similar things to me. But overall, I think it makes you have a distrust in life and a hopelessness to life. And that's depression at its finest. Like you
Yeah.
don't really believe in a purpose of living.
Yeah.
It's the hopelessness.
Yep.
And on the anxiety side, like that's just so many levels of
Mhm.
just like anxiety is for me mostly manifested as like social anxiety. I did not want to be contacting anyone who I didn't feel like understood me or respected me and my experience. And that kind of played into just not wanting to socialize at all. And I really had to like analyze it and overcome it.
Mhm.
And I was also anxious, like, like we talk about a lot, like for losing someone else and
Yep.
just how I was being perceived and how I compared to my peers and stuff.
Yeah, and that goes into grief-induced anxiety, like anxiety for losing someone else, anxiety for the way you found out, anxiety about certain things for yourself. For me, definitely health anxiety was one of them. I mean, I've always kind of leaned towards hypochondria my whole life. Like I've always had just like intrusive thoughts about my health and stuff.
Mhm.
And definitely after experiencing that loss, like it got worse in a sense and in every way. Yeah, that's definitely a huge kind of anxiety that has increased a lot for me. Definitely social anxiety at first too. Like I
Mhm.
just couldn't really get myself out of my head to socialize with others in that way that I used to. Like you, I've also like struggled with depression for a lot of my life too. I mean, my parents kind of divorcing slash separating when I was a freshman in high school kind of really triggered me into a really depressive but almost manic way of living. And I was like definitely more rebellious and like acting out in ways to kind of get attention, I think, from them, whether that was conscious or unconscious, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, I've definitely struggled with depression for a lot of my life. And I kind of joked about it in one of the podcasts where I was like, I was depressed before my dad died, and now I'm depressed
Mhm.
and my dad's dead. And that's just kind of how it is that like it just is like another thing for me to be sad
Mhm.
about. But at the same time, it's weird because for the first time, I feel like in my life, maybe I don't really feel depressed anymore. And I'm just more so on the anxious side. I still struggle with anxiety a lot, but in terms of depression, I kind of am coming out of that, I think. And I definitely still am sad and I experience like the waves of emotion, but I wouldn't say that I am
Mhm.
depressed anymore,
Chronically.
chronically depressed. What I'm trying to say is after the loss, it's easy to fall into a nihilistic point of view where you kind of think that life is meaningless and what's the point? And I was definitely deep in that mode for a while. And I guess my point now is that I'm starting to care about things and myself again and like seeing that things do matter, at least in my life, because I'm still existing, you know? Like I have no choice but to exist.
Mhm.
And so that means that these things in my life at least matter for me right now. And that's kind of the mentality I'm at right now. It's like
Yeah.
no longer nihilist, which took me a while.
Mhm.
And yeah, like it's a duality in itself because it can be like nothing matters, so I can do whatever the fuck I want and just encourage myself to really take on the moment because nothing matters. But at the same time, on the other side of that, it's like nothing matters, so why do anything at all? Because
Mhm.
it's depression to me is not like a feeling of sadness, it's a feeling of not caring about anything at all. It's a feeling of numbness, it's a feeling of like dissociation and then like separation from the rest of the world in a way that's not sad, just kind of like blank and
Mhm.
empty, which is even worse because you don't even care enough to feel sad. You know what I mean? And that's
Yeah.
what depression is.
Totally.
And that's a perfect segue into numbness, depersonalization, and derealization that we feel after loss too.
Yeah. I've talked about this in previous episodes and a couple of them in the first one and probably in some others, but when you experience derealization and depersonalization, well, first of all, if you don't know what that is, it's basically when you repeatedly have the feeling that you're outside of your body, like an out of body experience, that you're maybe observing yourself from the outside, or that you have a sense that the things around you aren't real. For instance, if you're looking in a mirror and you're like, am I real? Or is any of this real? Or is this actually happening? Kind of like existential dread in a way.
Yeah, but it's like
Two plays into that.
it's like questioning the existential state.
Yeah. It's kind of like feels like if you're a sim and then you're realizing you're a sim or some shit. It's like really fucking weird and scary as fuck,
Yeah,
basically.
it is.
And when you feel that persistently, you feel like a ghost, and it really plays into the whole, what is the purpose of life and why am I even living and what's the point of living? And it's really scary, but some things in personalization that you might feel is feeling like your body is wrong, feeling like your memories aren't yours or they're not real, not being able to quite recognize yourself in the mirror, not feeling in control of your speech or your movements, feeling numbness, like your senses are off, feeling detached from yourself, or feeling like I said, like outside of your body or like you're looking down from above. I think for me personally, I felt this depersonalization when I was first told about my mom and all this stuff. And I truly felt like I stepped outside my body. And that was the first time I've ever experienced it. And in the moment, it felt like a coping mechanism, and it is. But afterward, your body kind of stays in that fight or flight, and you start to deal with those types of things in just your normal day-to-day life. And that's when it gets really scary. And then for derealization, depersonalization, they're really similar, but they're also different. So for derealization, it's more about like the outside and not you personally. So derealization, you can feel detached from your surroundings, feel like everything around you seems distorted or muffled.
Mm-hmm.
Objects or people look wrong, blurry, unfamiliar, flat, too big or small, feeling like you're trapped inside a bubble, feeling like the world is unreal or like a dream. It feels foggy or artificial. It seems like a glass wall or veil is separating you from the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And time seems either sped up, slowed down, or stood still. These are just some of the things that you might feel. And I know that I've definitely felt these things before.
Mm-hmm. Me
Um,
too.
I can't really say much other than like it's really scary, but once you can acknowledge what it is, I think that's the first step in being able to try to pull yourself out of those moments, or at least recognizing that you're in those moments so that you know that this is not real. This is just a fleeting thought and it's your
Right.
brain reacting to what you've been through.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that this happened to me mostly the first year. And now that I'm finishing my second year of grief, it happens to me a lot less. Thank God, because this is one of the scariest things I've ever felt in my whole life. And this is one of the things that I never knew even existed or what it felt like until I started my grief journey.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think alongside of that, like you kind of learn different ways to help you pull yourself out of that and different coping mechanisms that help you specifically pull yourself back to a state of consciousness that you like.
I just want to say too that, when it comes to these feelings of numbness and derealization and depersonalization, like grief induces these things,
Yeah.
like people really like to say that grief is not mental illness, which I get their point because it's not. It's a normal human reaction. Like I just said on stories a couple of days ago, like don't feel like there's anything wrong that you need to fix yourself because this is just a normal reaction. And I stand by that. And I don't like it when people say grief isn't depression because I'm like, well, I mean, it for me, when you have a traumatic death experience in your family or someone really close to you,
Mhm.
that pushes you into this spiral of maybe you don't want to call it depression, but the symptoms are very similar.
Yeah.
And it literally creates a trauma response. And I think the derealization, depersonalization, depression, anxiety, all those things, like grief truly induces that. And I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion,
No, that's just a
but
fact.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah. You
For
know, at least in my
me,
lens.
it is.
Yeah.
And if you resonate with that,
I'm like, that's a
I
fact
I agree.
subjectively.
Because I've seen people on grief Instagram talk about how, and again, I get their point, I get it. They're like trying to say nothing's wrong with you, right? Like you don't have, but like for me, it's also validating on the other end of that to say, well, actually you do, and these things are real. Like this isn't just you reacting to the death. Like this is real, valid, fucking emotions. Yeah, I don't know. It's a duality again. Same thing with the DSM-5.
Yeah,
Like
the DSM-5 now includes the prolonged grief disorder, which I think is 6 months. After 6 months, and you still feel these symptoms, some of which we already mentioned in this podcast episode, but they're pretty much labeling it now as prolonged grief disorder, which is just very discerning and very invalidating to people who are experiencing a significant loss, and
yeah.
kind of like in a way stigmatizing this thing.
Yeah, it seemed so backwards, and a lot of people were mad about it. I mean, I'm not an expert on the DSM-5, and Megan Devine has a really good podcast episode on her podcast about that. Her podcast is called Hereafter. Amazing podcast, obviously, needless to say. But yeah, I mean, if you want to hear more about kind of that issue with the DSM-5 and, creating a grief disorder, there's kind of two sides to it. But I mean, it has to be said, like, of course, this is like the actual handbook for medical professionals when they're dealing with mental health disorders, and grief should be represented in the right way. But it's just kind of hard to say what's right and what's wrong.
Right, exactly. And it's like, just put the timeline on people's grief, and that's just unfair. In my opinion, as someone who is no one. And it's just someone who is grieving
You are
at home.
someone. You are a podcast creator.
As
You
a
are
podcast
griefluencer.
as a griefluencer. No, I don't want to call myself that.
I'm kidding. I'm joking,
I
everyone.
know. But the last thing I want to talk about is kind of the hardest thing to talk about. And I think that it is important to talk about because a lot of people experience this, is suicide ideation and suicidal thoughts.
Well, first disclaimer here.
Disclaimer.
We are not mental health professionals. Okay,
No.
so we are just trying our best.
Yeah.
But we're talking about things that we've felt in our own experience.
Right.
So we're not able to touch on everything perfectly.
Right. And we're also learning, and we're
not reading from a book here.
No, we're just talking about it from our own experience. And so that may not relate to everyone's experience. And so just keep that in mind while you're listening to this part, because we are really coming from a good place. We're not trying to stigmatize or say things wrong. We're really trying our best here. But we do want to bring awareness to this, because that is the realness of these kind of things. Is like, when you struggle with mental illness, or you have lived with a disorder your life, it gets really hard. And a lot of people have suicide ideation and suicidal thoughts. They battle these things because of how hard it is to feel like no one understands you and no one views the world the way you do.
Also, I just want to add that this is a really difficult topic to talk about. And I think sometimes there's a disconnect between people who are depressed and then people who are suicidal. And what I mean by that is there's a middle ground of people who feel that they desire to die and they don't consider it an option, and they don't plan for something. And we know that, what crosses the line from suicidal ideation to actual suicidal thoughts is the plan, having a plan. But I think we don't talk enough about suicidal ideation, where you want the pain to end and you'd rather not be here. And you think about death, and it's this constant, it's not a fleeting thought, but you don't have a plan and you don't consider it an option. That's the middle ground. But moving into when it does cross that line into suicidal thoughts, there's just a huge stigma, and there's a lot of shame surrounding having those thoughts, and guilt too. People don't understand the word suicide, and it really scares a lot of people. But for World Mental Health Day, I think it's really important that we speak openly about it. The only way to end the stigma and taboo behind it is if we talk about it. So preventing suicide requires us to actually speak openly, and that's what we're doing here. And even though we're not certified mental health professionals, we are firsthand experiencers and, adjacent to the mental health community because of our grief. Even though it's a really difficult topic to talk about, I think we would be wrong to omit this from our mental health discussion. And the thing about suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation is that it's really hard to admit out loud. And like I said, having a journal and doing those things are really important. Just reaching out, really expressing that, but expressing it to someone else and confiding in someone else physical person, is really important. There are stories of people who have overcome these thoughts, and you aren't an exception. You can be that. You can get to the other side of this. It's a big relief when you finally confide in someone. If you do relate to this episode and this podcast, please know that we'll be leaving resources in our description.
I mean, from the perspective of someone who's dealt with it, it's a really heartbreaking thought. But at the same time, you're almost at a point of you don't give a fuck. It's a very nihilistic point where you're like, what is the point? You don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. There is no light at the end of the tunnel when you're thinking these things. Like, that's why it's so hard, because when people are like, it's going to get better, it feels like it's so invalidating because there's no glimpse of hope in sight. And I want to talk from someone who has been on the other side of someone that I love telling me that they have suicidal and suicide ideation. It's heartbreaking on that side as well, because that shows you how much pain that person's been through and has experienced day to day. And of course, the second thing is the thought of losing that person is heartbreaking. And so it's like a really tough topic on both sides and all around in general.
Yeah. And for those who are feeling hopeless and they are feeling these feelings of wanting to end the pain, it's hard to try and articulate any type of advice. And I think any advice just sounds like dumb platitudes. And that's why this is so difficult. But all I can say, and all I've heard that seem to actually give light, is that as humans, all we really have is hope and a sort of blind faith. And even if you are feeling faithless and hopeless, there is still hope for hope. And I am really struggling to find the right words for this, because I don't really think there are really the right words. The only thing I know that I want to say is that we want you to stay, and there's people out there who want to be with you, and life is not fair, and it wasn't ever meant to be sunshine and rainbows all the time. And people who have struggled with this know that all too well. I know that that cannot be a comforting thought, but it's the only thing that I know helped me when I was struggling with these things is just having a small amount of hope and thinking about the things that I do love about life and the things that I don't want to leave behind. And like everything that we said 600 times in this episode, it comes and it goes. And if you can just hold on until the next moment where you can finally get a breath above the water, I hope that you can find that it was worth it to just hold on a little bit longer and hang in there for the next time you can get your head above water. You're not alone in feeling these things. There's
Yeah.
people everywhere who is dealing with the same exact things as you. I know it feels like so isolating that you're the only one and that no one understands, but there's so many people who relate to all these things.
And I think this kind of goes back into what we said in the beginning is talk about it. And I know that it's like some of the worst things to talk about. And something you don't even want to really admit out loud to yourself, let alone another person. So I acknowledge that that is like way easier said than done. But I think as humans, like one of the only things we can do is share the experiences that we go through and connect with other people. And that's going to be like what allows you to feel grounded and find stability or like find strength in numbers. And that's something we truly believe. Otherwise, we wouldn't have started this podcast. But I just want to say that like these things that we're saying, it's way easier said than done, such as like talking to someone, you know, that's a big task, especially given the weight of what you want to talk about. And it's also easy because of that to feel like a burden or feel like you're trauma dumping on someone and feel like that's way too much to share with someone that's like they're going to get overwhelmed. And I just want to say that if you do have people that really care about you, they're going to be more than willing to help and listen to you. And if they're not, then they're not the people for you in your life, like that shows, that says a lot about them as people. And also I want to acknowledge that there are people out there that really don't have anyone to turn to, and in those cases it's just like, what do I do? Who do I turn to? And I know that it's like really corny in a way, or like really predictable to say this, but that's what, you know, therapy is for. And services like hotlines and stuff like that offer you resources to have someone to talk to. And like Julia said earlier, even maybe talking to yourself and recording yourself on your phone and just to like verbalize what you're going through might help you in a little bit, might help you a bit too. But at the same time, I just want to say again that like everyone is different, and I'm not coming to you from the other side or like as someone who can actually, I don't know, not to say that I can't help you, but you know, as someone who is not specialized to do that. I also want to say about talking to people is that sometimes when you talk to the wrong person, it makes you feel even more isolated because you don't feel heard even though you're speaking, or you don't feel validated when you're speaking of something that means a lot to you or that is a lot. So I acknowledge that too, is that sometimes you speaking up doesn't necessarily lead to you feeling comforted in the way that you need. And that's really tough because then you really feel like, what's the fucking point? Because every time I speak, it gets misinterpreted or misunderstood.
Yeah.
And then it kind of leads you not wanting to talk about it at all. And then it leads you to feel isolated.
Well, also, if you're feeling particularly alone, there are so many online groups, and you know, if you want to join like a Facebook group or something, they have so many people who really just talking so raw
Right.
about their emotions and what they feel. And it could be a good outlet, and also, make you realize that there are people going through the same things as you, and maybe you can find a friend that way. I'm always a big advocate for, finding friends who like really truly understand what you're going through.
Mhm.
And like I've found a lot of friends through the internet because that's how we connect. Because I'm not going to go walking around, asking people, oh, like who has a dead mom, but DM some random people on Instagram, DM some random people on Facebook. Like honestly, I've found a lot of people that way. Well, this is what mental health awareness looks like, y'all. It's choppy and it's sad and it's confusing, but it's not a pretty little infographic on Instagram. I love my infographics. Not to hate on infographics this whole episode, but hopefully you see my point that, we're not going to end this episode on a happy note. And that's the fucking reality. And that is the point. And these things are hard to say. Like it really is difficult. I think this might be the hardest episode we've filmed to date, but it has to be said.
It
It's
has
mental
to be
health.
said.
It's mental health day. It's mental health week. Like, I don't know if no one else is doing it, like someone's got to do it. And
Exactly.
it's got to be raw like this and not planned out or scripted or, like it's just facts and feelings. And
Mhm.
I hope that our true intentions were clear throughout this episode. And, even though we may not say all the right things or know everything,
Mhm.
um, our intention is to just be here to talk about it.
Yes.
And honestly, I think that's all we can do. And if everyone did that, I think that would be steps into the right direction.
And that's pretty much everything, you guys, for this week. We'll see you guys next week. Next week, we have Sophia Bilesma. She's a third-year medical student here in San Diego. And we're going to be talking to her a little bit more about medical aid in dying, dying with dignity, and alternative options to funerals, including green burials and doing things another way because funerals fucking suck. And if you want to know about funeral sucking, you can go watch our funeral episode. But yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.